As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
The real problem with our foreign policy. Over the weekend, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin explained to the American people what's really wrong with U.S. foreign policy. Some might find his conclusions surprising. The U.S. standing in the world is damaged not because we spent 20 years fighting an Afghan government that had nothing to do with the attacks on 9/11. The problem has nothing to do with neocon lies about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction that led untold civilian deaths in another failed democratization mission. It's not because over the past nearly 2 years, Washington has taken more than $150 billion from the American people to fight a proxy war with Russia through Ukraine. It's not the military-industrial complex or its massive lobbying power that extends throughout Congress, the think tanks, and the media. Speaking at the Reagan National Defense Forum in California's Simi Valley, Austin finally explained the real danger to the U.S. global military empire. It's us. According to Secretary Austin, noninterventionism who advocate an American retreat from responsibility are the ones destabilizing the world, not endless neocon wars. Austin said the U.S. must continue to play the role of global military hegemon, policeman of the world, because the world will only become more dangerous if tyrants and terrorists believe that they can get away with wholesale aggression and mass slaughter. How's that for reason and logic? Austin and the interventionist elites have fact-checked 30 years of foreign policy failures and concluded, well, it would have been much worse if the non-interventionists were in charge. This is one of the biggest problems with the neocons. They are incapable of self-reflection. Each time the U.S. government follows their advice into another catastrophe, it's always someone else's fault. In this case, as Austin tells us, those at fault for U.S. foreign policy misadventures are the people who say, don't do it. What would have happened if the people who said, don't do it, were in charge of President Obama's decision to prop up al-Qaeda to overthrow Syria's secular leader, Assad? How about if the don't do it people were in charge when the neocons manufactured a human rights justification to destroy Libya? What if the don't do it people were in charge when Obama's neocons thought it would be a great idea to overthrow Ukraine's democratically elected government? Would tyrants and terrorists have gained power if Washington did not get involved? No, tyrants and terrorists got their upper hand because Washington intervened in these crises. As Austin further explained, part of the problem with U.S. is democracy itself. Our competitors don't have to operate under continuing resolutions. He complained, what a burden it is for him that the people, through their representatives, are in charge of war spending. In Congress, America First foreign policy sentiments is on the rise among conservatives, and that infuriates Austin and his ilk. He wants more billions for wars in Ukraine and Israel, and he wants it now. And our economic problems, that is our fault too. Those who try to pull up the drawbridge, Austin said, undermine the security has led to decades of prosperity. Prosperity? Has he looked at the national debt, inflation, destruction of the dollar? There is a silver lining here. The fact that Austin and the neocons are attacking us non-interventionists means that we are gaining ground. They are worried about us. This is our chance to really raise our voices. Thanks for listening.
So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has hit out at Americans who prefer a less interventionist foreign policy, smearing them as isolationists who want to see the U.S. retreat from responsibility. So Austin, who is a former Raytheon board member, it's important to point out when we talk about him that right before he took over at the Pentagon, he was sitting on the board of Raytheon, which is one of the largest weapons makers, military contractors in the U.S. And Austin made these comments in a speech at the Reagan National Defense Forum in California on Saturday. And I have to give credit to Ron Paul and Dan McAdams for covering what Austin said in that speech in their show, where I might have missed this. I overlooked these very interesting comments that Austin made. So he said, quote, in every generation, some Americans prefer isolation to engagement, and they try to pull up the drawbridge. They try to kick loose the cornerstone of American leadership, end quote. The Pentagon chief accused less interventionist Americans of trying to, quote, undermine the security architecture that has produced decades of prosperity without great power war, end quote. So it's interesting that he says that there has been no great power war. Well, he's been the one that has overseen this policy, this Ukraine policy of shipping, dumping, billions and billions of dollars worth of weapons into Ukraine to fuel a proxy war with Russia, this great power, this major nuclear power. And primarily, for the most part, most people who are against the U.S. being involved in Ukraine are because it risks a great power war, because it greatly increases the chance of the U.S. and Russia, NATO and Russia fighting directly, which could quickly turn into a nuclear war. So it's just worth pointing out that he's responsible for all these increased tensions between the U.S. and another great power like Russia. And also, he's also overseeing this huge military buildup over in the Asia Pacific, increasing tensions with China. So Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, has scheduled a vote for Wednesday to advance President Biden's massive $106 billion emergency spending request that includes military aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, as well as additional funding for the border. This was reported by Politico. So I said $105 billion in the last story. My math was actually wrong on this bill. I should correct that in the other one. I went through each kind of itemized thing today, and it's a little over $106 billion. I thought I did that before, and it was over 105, but I guess I had it wrong. But this vote is not expected to pass. Republicans have said they would block the request if Democrats do not make certain concessions on border policies. While the bill includes $13.6 billion for border security, the GOP is looking for asylum law changes that would make it more difficult for migrants to enter the country, but a deal has not been reached. So while there's all this funding for border security, the Republicans actually want to tighten up rules and the laws when it comes to people coming in to the country. So Schumer's reasoning for scheduling a vote that will likely fail is to instill a sense of urgency for the Senate to advance funding for the war in Ukraine, Israel's assault on Gaza, and the military buildup aimed at China. Schumer said, quote, I urge every single senator to think where we are at this moment in history. America's national security is on the line around the world, in Europe, in the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific, end quote. So Schumer also announced that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will brief senators in a video conference on Tuesday to make a fresh pitch for the U.S. to continue funding his war with Russia. The White House sent a letter to congressional leaders warning that it's running out of money to fund the proxy war in Ukraine. And this is from Shalonda D. Young. She's the head of the White House's Office of Management and Budget. She said, quote, I want to be clear, without congressional action by the end of the year, we will run out of resources to procure more weapons and equipment for Ukraine and to provide equipment from U.S. military stocks. There is no magical pot of funding available to meet this moment. We are out of money and nearly out of time, end quote. So there actually is a magical pot of money that the Pentagon has, and that is the leftover funds that became available after they discovered an accounting error, a so-called accounting error, that overvalued previous weapons shipped to Ukraine. So that gave them $6 billion to work with. So by my count, they still have around $5 billion of that money, and that's just funding that allows them to ship weapons directly to Ukraine. But without that error, they wouldn't have any money left. So she detailed some of the numbers here. She said, quote, as of mid-November, DOD has used 97% of the $62.3 billion it received, and state has used 100% of the $4.7 billion in military assistance that it received. Approximately $27.2 billion has been used for economic assistance and the civilian security assistance to Ukraine, which is just as essential to Ukraine's survival as military assistance. State and USAID have used 100% of this amount, end quote. So she's saying everything else is dried up besides a little bit left at the Pentagon. And she's saying that the U.S. has been sending smaller weapons packages for Ukraine because it is running out of funding. And I mentioned she uses that term again, the defense industrial base, basically saying this money is going to give more contracts to Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, all these defense contractors that are cashing in on this war. Despite all these signs that Ukraine has no chance of winning this war, they're looking to fund it for another entire year through the 2024 election. That's why they want $61 billion, because they don't want to have to worry about trying to get these funds approved again. They're very frustrated by the democratic process in the U.S.
We've been trying very hard to cultivate this America First anti-war right over the last generation here, as people are alienated from the Bush and McCain foreign policy of the past. And then with And they've been gone really since, look, the real anti-war left, credit where it's due, the core of them have stayed. But the mass of the anti-war left has been AWOL since '06, before Obama even came to town, just when Pelosi won the House and Senate back in '06. Right. They climbed back in there on Cindy Sheehan's back, and the anti-war left has been pretty silent. Now they come back waving Palestinian flags and tearing down American flags and this kind of thing. And the anti-war right, the America First right, is so repelled by that now they're thinking about supporting foreign war again, just so that they're not a commie and not associated with people to their left acting like such jackasses, blocking freeways and all of these things that make decent people so angry, you know?
Yeah, well, the networked right was largely sympathetic to Israel's cause for that reason in particular. I mean, they had the similar enemies, the kind of the woke left, the people protesting in terms of raising, Palestinian flags and ripping down American flags. All that stuff really triggered them. But what happened was that the pro-Israeli faction saw any kind of delving into the kind of facts of the conflict or any kind of even lukewarm support in the networked right for Israel as kind of they started labeling it as anti-Semitism and started attacking them. If you look at Daryl's threads, whenever he looks into anything, he's attacked constantly as an anti-Semite. So it's what. And they did that to Candace Owens. They did it to others, and the reaction on the networked right, the dissident right, is that they bristle when they're told they can't do something. They can't recognize facts or dig into the facts. They can't. They hate it when they're called names for no good reason other than to silence them.
Well, it's certainly crippling Joe Biden's electability here. He is down right off the bat. He was down 11 points, and it may be much more than that by the time he's done. And then this one was maybe too good to be true. I don't know. It wasn't like the most deeply sourced poll had it at 56%. But then a recent another poll, I'm sorry, I don't remember which one, John, but you've probably seen it, has 50% of American Republicans want a ceasefire. I mean, This is just incredible. I mean, their knee is supposed to be jerking for Likud right now, and somehow it's malfunctioning.
Yeah, going into this conflict, Israel had 80% support with people over 65. I mean, that's the most loyal cohort. And what happens even with the nightly news and in the traditional news that those folks are consuming is that the online information flow is upstream of the traditional media's information flow. So what goes on online, what gets decided online, what gets unearthed and discovered and propagated online, eventually ends up dictating how the news covers those topics. From the language, from the information that's used, it's where they find stuff and they actually put it in, how to kind of spin it and conjugate it and approach it and frame it. So if you win online, you win the traditional news too, and that's having an effect on these older voters as well. It's just that at the current pace of events is that Israel is going to end up becoming isolated and lose the support of the United States, and the squeeze on the senators and congressmen and others who are providing kind of defensive fire for them inside U.S. political machines is going to diminish very rapidly. And what happens with BDS? I mean, I went to South Africa in the 80s and I saw the pressure they were under, justifiably so, for their former government, and being isolated to that extent is something that's not survivable, particularly for a small country.
Well, I think for Israel, the threat that they'd really be cut off from global capital is very minimal, but it's still, regardless, PDS is a huge public relations catastrophe for them because it just raises the question. First of all, you're labeling it apartheid Israel, which is accurate and can't be just explained away. And also, it just raises huge questions of controversy in some neutral Joe's mind. Why would anyone want to boycott Israel? I thought we like Israel. And then the answer is, well, therein hangs the tale. Pal, let me tell you about the occupation. Let me tell you what you don't know about why people indeed would be so upset that they would have a campaign like this. And personally, I'm against sanctions of all kinds, but I'll take the B and the D. And I know a lot of libertarians who feel the same way about that. And it is, if nothing else, it's a way of adding more people to the swarm, as you would call it, I guess, right? Or maybe you would just say raising the level of consciousness of Americans and others as to who's occupying who over there and what's the big controversy anyway. Well, I mean, our buddy Daryl pointed out that even despite the fact that Hamas's atrocity of the 7th was unparalleled, and is far beyond anything they had ever done before, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people killed, civilians killed, never mind the IDF, but it was just this huge atrocity. And yet within a very short amount of time, it was not just the radical left or something, but it was consensus that you're on probation, Israel. Don't go too far. And this kind of sentiment, kind of right away, people were willing to question what they were going to do, possibly even really before they started much of the bombing campaign. People were already looking very skeptically in spite of the horror of what had just happened. So in other words, the ball has moved very far down the field already, right?
Have McNamara before him saying there were 3 million Vietnamese dead because of our war in Vietnam. Now, we talk about 8 million Jews. That was a genocide during the Third Reich. Is 3 million not enough for a genocide? I think it qualifies. And with 2 million plus in Gaza, that qualifies too. So, he was a beast. He did.
How was he responsible for the millions of deaths? Are you talking about expanding the Vietnam War into Cambodia?
That's right. Yeah. And they actually had plans to move all the way up there into North Vietnam and China. And this is a hopeful note. There were such mass demonstrations, 1 million people in Central Park, that this prevented Kissinger and Nixon from doing this madman act as though they were going to do a nuclear bomb. Okay. And that's recounted in a wonderful documentary now, The Madman and the Movement. Look it up. I think it's available online. You really ought to see that. We give everyone hope that these demonstrations, these marches, are not in vain. They often have an effect that you don't realize has the effect for years later.
What was the Madman Act that Nixon and Kissinger had contemplated, which the demonstrators in Central Park prevented?
Well, Nixon wanted the Vietnamese and the Chinese to think that he was a madman enough to use a nuclear weapon. Okay, now he wasn't. Thank God. I hope nobody is. But he wanted that to make the communists give up. I don't know who told him that would make the communists give up. It wasn't us. Okay, he was just about to do that. Move those troops up toward Hanoi and into right onto the border of China. And these demonstrations prevented that, and that's provable. We have documents that came out just within the last year that show that these mass demonstrations had a real salutary effect and effect toward peace in the world.
Kissinger's legacy in a word or a sentence or a phrase?
Well, I think it's twofold. One, you need a basic concept of morality, so you don't do things like genocide. The other is that you need to be smart, and when you see opportunities like the Sino-Soviet conflict, you can leverage that into good policies for the United States. That's precisely what he did. And right now, we have a relationship with Russia and China where they have the long ends of this triangle now, and we are on the short end of the stick. And Kissinger didn't like that either. He complained about it, but just mildly when he was in his late 90s, just before he died.
I'm going to play an old-fashioned propaganda clip produced by the government. This is Nixon and Mao, of course, orchestrated by Kissinger. Because this is so old, the first 10 seconds of it are silent, but just be patient. You'll recognize the faces. You'll recognize the voice. You and I are of an age where we remember these things, and you'll certainly recognize government propaganda. Henry Kissinger joins President Nixon to meet with Chairman Mao in China.
Last bestowed during the first day of a state visit on former Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Dr. Henry Kissinger sits in on the talks that are animated, constructive, and frank. At the summit, face to face, two leaders who direct the destiny of 1 out of 3 persons on the earth. The gate to friendly contact, says Joe and Lai, has finally been opened.
Produced to you by your friends in Langley, Virginia.
Well, actually, Judge, that wasn't far from the truth. There was euphoria there. I mean, through very artful diplomacy and people like Chas Freeman, who were really good with language, there was a joint agreement, the Shanghai Communique, which said there's just one China, okay? That Taiwan is part of that one China. That was U.S. policy back to 1972, for God's sake. Now, I don't know why Biden doesn't get it or why these guys decide that they want to challenge China over Taiwan, but I guess it makes a lot of money for the arms manufacturers and the people who build the warships. So, that was all solved. Yeah, it was an imperfect solution, but there was one China. We recognize that. Why we're tempting the Taiwanese to declare independence or to give them the wherewithal to resist an invasion from the mainland is beyond me, other than we think we can sell more arms that way, and that we are, after all, the indispensable nation. We can work our will in any way we see fit.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Well, a lot of what you're talking about and what I'm talking about boils down to the question of whether the people who rule over us, and by that I don't necessarily mean exclusively the political class. I also mean the intellectual classes who try to rule over our minds, the people in the universities. Is it just an accident that one academic discipline after another is completely laughable and corrupt? As we've seen, I keep talking about the replication crisis, and we talked about this at our lunch, but that went way beyond psychology. That was one discipline after another, turned out to have one bogus, phony paper after another. There are certain areas of chemistry where you might be able to trust what's going on, but it's just a complete you-know-what show going on in academia. It is. So we have those people, we have the political classes. The issue is, are these people just bumbling fools who mean well, and they're trying their best to make our lives better, but they just keep misfiring? Or are they actually sinister people? And I went through they're just bumbling fools, and if only I could get them to read this textbook on economics, that would change things around. But if they were bumbling fools, wouldn't they bumble into the right thing once in a while just by accident? And yet every single elite obsession is anti-human without exception and based on propaganda. So yeah, I can't prove that they all had a meeting where they said they were going to coordinate this, but what I can prove is everything they're obsessed with runs counter to the flourishing of mankind. So that's as far as I've gone.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to pick you up on one particular point you made, they want you to believe that they're bumbling fools. That is part of the trick, because if they can persuade people who might otherwise take action against them, that with a few more well-written editorial pieces and a few more incisive podcasts, we can show them the light. We can change their minds. We can make them better people and effect better policies. That's part of the illusion. Stuff that kids are watching today is appalling. The stuff involving demons and sort of celebrating this kind of demonic iconography. All the symbolism they engage in, like you'll see people covering up one eye, or you'll see Madonna and people doing this. These are all Masonic stroke Illuminati stroke cult symbolisms, which indicate that they have made a pact, and the pact is they get worldly success in return for selling their souls, literally.
Well, even if you're somebody who just thinks of the devil as a metaphor, as indeed, no doubt, a lot of bad people do.
Yeah.
What I think drives at least a good many of them is simply a desire to destroy, a hatred for bourgeois normality, a real hatred of it. And where it comes from in the case of each individual can vary. Could be because of their upbringing, could be whatever, a lot of factors. But it's a desire to destroy, and it calls to mind, for me, some of the early, I'm sure you know, some of the poems that Karl Marx wrote when he was younger. And these poems are direct appeals to the devil. We laugh at that because we're sophisticated modern people. We laugh at that. But it's very revealing that what he hates about God is that God can create in a fundamental way because he creates out of nothing. And Marx says, I can create nothing. And he seeks to destroy. And it seems to me that regardless of what their relationship is to a devil or whether they think that way or not, what they're possessed of is nevertheless a devilish hatred of, frankly, things that are good and decent and normal that they want to overturn. They want chaos. They want disorder. And by interesting coincidence, it so happens the state thrives on chaos and disorder because then it will impose its own order. So, of course, it wants families pitted against each other over gender theory because it's got them right where they want them now. Because now they can be propagandizing the kids apart from the parents about their gender identity, whatever. I mean, these ideologies, just by coincidence, they all happen to serve state interests?
Yeah. If you look at what's happening in the world on every level, and I think this process accelerated during the 20th century, and it's hyper accelerated in the 21st century. And you see it affecting all sorts of things. For example, the way that classical music in the early 20th century stopped being about making beautiful melodious sounds and started being atonal and shrieky and horrible and discomforting. And you saw similar things happening in literature. You saw modernism happening. You saw James Joyce. People stopped writing great novels like War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Instead wrote this kind of edgy, jumbled up stuff that we were encouraged to think was the new thing and special. And then you look at what happened to art. You think about all the Renaissance masterpieces. You think of Bellini and so on, his paintings, and then you move forward to the kind of stuff they were doing in the early 20th century, and then in the 1950s, the CIA started funding all this kind of modern stuff by Jackson Pollock, and so suddenly squiggles and swirls and splodges were were art. I mean, how
and,
do you
by the way,
compare-
anybody who thinks James made that up, this is openly acknowledged now. The idea was to make the Eastern Bloc feel like they'd fallen behind. They weren't quite avant-garde enough. Because look at all this wonderful modern art that we're doing.
Yeah.
Oh, they must have gotten a good laugh out of that one when people actually started pretending that this was all really cool and amazing. So I've made this same observation. I think other people have. That again, you look at music, you look at art, you look at literature. There's no center. Same with architecture. There's no idea that. I mean, and incidentally, even like during the Enlightenment is claiming that the universe is kind of like a machine, that human society can be ordered by reason. And the result of that, no, the Enlightenment has a lot of problems. I'm not endorsing or criticizing the Enlightenment here, but when you have that worldview, it's not a surprise that you have music that tends to be quite orderly, that follow the symphonies that follow sonata form, symmetry, all things like that. But when that center has been knocked away, when Einstein is telling you that those things you thought were constants and those things that you thought made sense actually don't, and then you have philosophers who are reaching conclusions that, again, are making it seem like everything's meaningless. Well, how would you be surprised that the cultural manifestation of that would be chaos and ugliness?
Shalonda Young, she's the director of the OMB. I guess that's Stockman's old job, right? Shalonda wrote a letter to the administration saying, "We are out of money to support Ukraine in this fight. This isn't a next year problem," she said. "The time to help a democratic Ukraine fight against Russian aggression is now. It's time for Congress to act." Now that looks a little more political than I would suspect an OMB director would write. I don't know, Dr. Paul, maybe I'm just naive. Seems like they should be just kind of doing the numbers rather than politicking. But what she's saying is they have not passed this emergency supplemental war appropriations for Ukraine. We're out of money for Ukraine. We got to get them money immediately because in 3 weeks, boom, it's all done. Not a penny's left for Ukraine. So I think it smacks a little bit of desperation on the part of the administration because we have had a series of bad news pieces about Ukraine. Now, these are things that are not surprising to our viewers because our viewers are very intelligent and they have followed, as we have, people like Colonel McGregor and so many others who have said from the beginning, this is a failed enterprise. Ukraine cannot win. This is like David taking on Goliath. Cannot win. This will never go well. But of course, the neocons in D.C., Dr. Paul, said, we can do it. We can take down Russia. Who cares? Remember, even Lindsey Graham says, this is the best money we've ever spent. Ukrainians are dying and the Russians are getting weak. And that's a cynical view. Well, Americans have woken up to this, and we've followed the numbers. Americans are opposed to more spending across the board. Republicans and Democrats opposed to more spending on Ukraine. And nevertheless, these people never admit that they're wrong. And so now they're desperate for more money. Now, Republicans, being Republicans, don't just stand up and say, hey, America doesn't want this. No way, Jose, we're out. No, they say, what can we get for this? What can we get if we give them a yes vote and send another $100 billion or $60 billion to Ukraine? Let's get something for it. That's how they think.
And back to the director of OMB, she said, and you essentially have repeated what she said, the director Young argues the remaining funds are rapidly running out, the fear thing. And my thoughts when I read that, I said, why is she saying that they're running out? They've run out of those funds a long time ago. They didn't even have the funds when they started the dumb war, But that is why, the great facilitator who can print money out of thin air, the counterfeiters. Yeah. That is why, this whole argument that foreign policy is separate from economic policy, you just can't do it because all the money is spent has to be printed at this rate. And, it's going up. This year, the numbers, even when I condition myself for this, the amount of debt that's going to increase this year is astounding. Yeah. I mean, trillions and trillions of dollars now are just rapidly, it's on an exponential curve, and I don't think they can reverse that. The Quincy Institute, related with the responsible statecraft, the article we read came from Responsible Statecraft, but the Quincy Institute, they were quoting Bill Hartung. Oh, yeah. And he recently wrote, and what I'm going to address is the subject, it's this good jobs program. Everybody's employed. I've hit at that all the time because nobody seems to care as long as they get a check. And but the jobs report today, terrible. And then back a month ago, they revised. So the real significant evidence of the downturn and the recession that must come, according to Austrian theory, is it has to come to rectify all the mistakes, the inflationary mistakes, the spending, the debt, and that sort of thing. And he wrote in, Hartung had written in RS Foreign, wrote in RS, foreign military aid is not an effective jobs program. He was refuting that. And this is a close quote from Hartung. There are many ways to create more and better jobs without resorting to increased weapons spending. Virtually any form of government, I have a question on this a little bit, virtually any form of government outlay or even tax cut yield better employment. He was doing equality. This is the worst jobs program. Yeah. But anyway, and then I wrote on my suggestion, there are other ways that are more efficient. Let the people keep their money. Get rid of the taxes. Believe me, that would handle it. And that's what happened in 1921 when they had their depression. They just said, well, take care of it. You got your bankruptcy, deal with it. And it didn't last very long. So this is so attractive, to say it's a jobs program, people will do well. And they keep equating the creation of money as an answer, but it's the creation of wealth that matters. And we have gradually, steadily over 100 years, the wealth that we had accumulated and built into the system. And even though it was recognizable, people assume, well, we're king of the hill, we have the empire and we have the dollars. But I tell you what, the wealth is running out of it. So they're talking about wealth. Yes, they can keep printing this money, but it will not substitute for real wealth, even if they think they have to fight more wars with it. And so in a way, the market, fortunately, is going to work in our favor, that they just can't perpetuate these wars. And that's one of the major fights they have over here, because there's some in the House of Representatives that are sick and tired of sending more money to Ukraine.
There's a lot.
So you want to mention anything about the Pentagon?
Yeah, let's go on.
Pentagon can't account for a little bit, 63%. They don't know where it went. But they don't. That's a couple bucks. Yeah. Maybe you just walk out on the sidewalk, you might find it. 63% of nearly $4 trillion in assets. Yeah. Boy, they're doing well, But that's not wealth. That's wealth taken and converted into the assets of criminals, and the criminals who want to perpetuate their financial power and the welfare warfare state. And so far, they have done well. But news like this is very helpful, because it wouldn't take a PhD to look at this and say, well, let me see, I don't know much about math or anything, but I do know a little bit of arithmetic. That sounds like a lot of money.